Needful Things, Stephen King's 1991 novel, is another great example of how King uses small towns as a microcosm. In this case, his most regularly revisited small town, Castle Rock, is used as a setting which allows King to discuss broader narratives on a smaller scale, to condense, encapsulate, and critique much larger social, societal issues. Those issues being Reagan-era neoliberal capitalist policy, the way that the powerful sow division and discontent amongst the citizenry in an effort to maintain power, and how religious zealots control their congregants with false promises and delusions of grandeur. Hi there, I'm your host, Mr. Doyle, and this is A Great Undertaking. If you enjoy the novels of Stephen King, devious shopkeepers, and blaming all of the world's problems on corrupt religious grifters and unfettered capitalism by way of neoliberal policy, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Wow, so it's been over a month since my last video, which is a really long time for me. Life has been... it hasn't been bad, it's just been stupid busy, which leaves me with very little time to work on my hobbies and passion projects. I spent the last 2 weeks rehearsing with and running lights for a production of The Little Mermaid Jr. with a cast of 30 children. The show is, of course, a Disney musical theater production, so yeah, I'm pretty sure this is life making a joke at my expense after I regularly complained about disliking musicals in previous videos. Anyway, thanks to everyone who's checked in on me to see how I've been doing, and to all the new folks who have subscribed to the channel. Turns out my sub counts go up way faster when I'm not regularly making videos, which is contrary to what I assumed would happen, so that's interesting. Also, side note, this is the second time I've had to record this video because some idiot, me, forgot to turn the microphone on again. Someday I will hate myself less. But anyway, I'm back with this first video in a 2-video series for Stephen King's Needful Things. In this video, I'll be discussing the novel itself and what influenced King while he was writing it, as well as the not so thinly veiled religious and social critiques that can be found within the story, or at least my interpretation of them. And in my next video, I'll be taking a look at the 1993 feature-length film adaptation of Needful Things, which I've never watched before, but it's got Father Merrin himself, Max von Sydow, and Ed Harris in it, so it can't be entirely terrible, right? Full disclosure, the ideas and topics that King covers in Needful Things are inherently political, and so there will be discussion of politics, social issues, and a variety of religious and ideological topics. So if you're not into that sort of thing, and I totally get it if you're not here for that, just understand that these topics are baked into the novel, and so I'm discussing them both because it is necessary, and because I find these topics to be interesting for a number of personal reasons. So if you don't agree with my views on the issues, by all means let me know in the comments. Just understand that I will be freely displaying my own personal views, which I am 100% willing to admit will be biased and coming from a leftist perspective. Before we get too deep into the text and subtext of King's novel, here's a quick recap for those who are unfamiliar and for those who may need a refresher. Needful Things, a brief summary. There's a new shop opening up in Castle Rock, and the town folks are all curious to see just what this new business and its mysterious proprietor have to offer. When the shop finally opens, what at first appears to be a gallery of random artifacts and collectibles of all varieties turns out to be exactly what everyone in town has always wanted. There's truly something special for everyone who sets foot in the store. These seemingly random miscellaneous objects each have an allure to particular people, and the shopkeeper, Mr. Leland Gaunt, makes them all an offer that they simply can't refuse on the item that most catches their eye. But Gaunt isn't all that interested in money, and he asks a great deal more from his customers than a simple cash transaction. The clientele are always willing to pay whatever the price, though, because their new possessions hold a power that reaches beyond simple nostalgia or interest, and Gaunt is one hell of a salesman. In exchange for the item they want the most, they must do a favor for Mr. Gaunt, often at the expense of another resident of Castle Rock, and always with reverberating consequences, which are all a part of Gaunt's elaborate scheme. Before it's all over, Castle Rock and its residents will be left in utter shambles as the townspeople turn on one another and play their part in the undoing and unabashed destruction of everything they once held dear. History and inspiration. When Needful Things was published in 1991, it was initially being billed as the final Castle Rock story. King had decided it was time to move on from the town that so many of his stories had been set in and find a new setting to turn his attention to. And while he wouldn't revisit the rock for quite some time following the publication of Needful Things, King would find himself returning to the small town a handful of times later in his bibliography, most recently with the Gwendy trilogy. In regards to what inspired King to write the novel, the following excerpt comes directly from King himself via his website, and it reads as follows. Quote, "I guess I was one of the few people in the United States who thought the 80s were really funny. It was a decade in which people decided, for a while at least, that greed was good and that hypocrisy was simply another tool for getting along. It was the last hurrah for cigarettes, unsafe sex, and all sorts of drugs. It was the final corruption of the love and peace generation, the big cop-out, and I thought it was a case of having to laugh. It was either that or cry. I was thinking about all this one night while driving home from a basketball game, and my thoughts centered on Jim and Tammy Faye Baker of the PTL Club. It occurred to me that in the 80s, everything had come with a price tag, that the decade quite literally was the sale of the century. The final items up on the block had been honor, integrity, self-respect, and innocence. By the time I got home that night, I had decided to turn the 80s into a small-town curio shop called Needful Things and see what happened. I told myself to keep it light and surreal, that if I just kept in mind the baker's doghouse, which had been equipped with heaters and running water, I would be okay. And that's what I did." Unquote. Honestly, I hadn't initially interpreted Needful Things as any sort of religious analogy, but after reading that excerpt, I feel silly for not making the connection. Though, based on that King quote, it wasn't entirely about religion, but rather Needful Things was about the adoption of neoliberal economic policies by the Reagan administration in the 80s, and how those policies had a widespread corroding effect from which nothing was exempt or sacred, especially not faith-based organized religious establishments. So, Let's take a look at who Jim and Tammy Faye Baker were and how neoliberalism has affected religious institutions and the entirety of American life since the 1980s. But first, won't you please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and following along as I fail miserably to consistently make videos because life is chaos and I don't have enough time to do the things I enjoy anymore. Thanks in advance. Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. I wish King had elaborated on why he had been thinking about Jim and Tammy Faye Baker while writing this story, but after reading up on who the Bakers were and what their legacy was, I think we can draw some likely conclusions in regards to just why King had the Bakers on the brain and how he applied that to this story. I was vaguely familiar with Jim and Tammy Faye, but outside of being OG televangelists, I wasn't aware of the details of the Baker family history. Unsurprisingly, Jim and Tammy's rise and self-righteous religious crusades were riddled with serious accusations, court settlements, and convictions for a variety of criminal activities, because of course, they were white Christian nationalist American televangelists who figured out how to monetize their congregation's faith, so naturally they were getting up to all kinds of Dickens. Well, at least Jim Baker was. We'll talk about him first, and then we'll touch on Tammy Faye briefly later. James Orson Baker was born in Michigan in 1940, and while attending college he met his future wife Tammy Faye. The two of them left school to become traveling evangelists, and in 1966 they landed a gig working for Pat Robertson's TV network hosting a children's program. Eventually Jim would become the host of the 700 Club, which was the flagship program of the Christian Broadcast Network. Baker took part in and preached what is known as the prosperity gospel. Though not one of its forefathers, the prosperity gospel had been around since the late 19th century, Baker was one of the prominent early televangelists to embrace the prosperity gospel, alongside the likes of Kenneth Hagin, Frederick Casey Price, and the literal most terrifying person in history to look at, Kenneth Copeland. The prosperity gospel is the belief that God rewards those who believe in him and practice their religion the right way. It's a belief that should you devote your life to the Lord and remain steadfast in your faith, that you will be adorned with health, wealth, and a life of abundant blessings. Prosperity gospel taught its congregants that one could overcome poverty and illness and ward off tragedy through the power of prayer, which obviously works because the United States no longer has mass shootings thanks to all those thoughts and prayers. Keep up the good work, folks. Jim and Tammy Faye would eventually leave the Christian Broadcast Network and start their own television program and an entire network in 1974, which were named the PTL Club and the PTL Satellite Network, respectively. And this seems to be where Jim Baker's troubles began. In the late 70s, the Bakers would come under investigation by the Federal Communications Commission, which led to the FCC alleging that the Bakers were misusing funds they raised through their PTL Club TV show. The PTL in PTL Club stands for Praise the Lord, just in case you were wondering. The FCC had forwarded its report to the Department of Justice, but the DOJ declined to press charges after determining they lacked sufficient evidence. Jim Baker called the FCC investigation a witch hunt and used the scandal to fire up his fandom and to raise even more funds from his supporters. That sounds vaguely familiar. Then, in the early 80s, an Internal Revenue Service investigation determined that the Bakers had used over $1 million in ministry funds to pad out their own personal piggy bank. The IRS recommended that the PTL Club be stripped of their nonprofit status, which of course meant that they were a tax-exempt organization. No actions were taken immediately, though. mostly due to the fact that the Reagan administration knew that taking down the Bakers would likely have a negative effect on Reagan's polling and re-election chances. You know, since the Venn diagram of Baker's congregation and Reagan's voters was just one big circle. It wasn't until 1987 when Jim Baker got caught up in a hush money scandal to cover up a grape accusation that Jim Bob finally had to answer for his sinful behavior. Baker and an associate named John Fletcher were accused by a woman named Jessica Hahn of drugging and her at a hotel. Hahn was paid nearly $300,000 in exchange for her silence. However, it wasn't because Hahn came forward about the allegations that the truth came out. Apparently, Baker used PTL funds to pay off Hahn, and he had kept 2 sets of books in an effort to keep the payment of the PTL records. This is, of course, very illegal and is what led to him being caught. Following the hush money scandal, so many parallels. Following the hush money scandal and the reports of Baker's financial crimes coming out, allegations that Baker was also participating in homosexual activities were made by both his associate Fletcher and Jay Babcock, who was the director of PTL at the time. This accusation is obviously the least serious of all of them, but when you're televangelist Jim Baker, the whole "he loves the cock" thing was likely the most damning accusation to come out to those amongst Baker's flock. The story goes on with various other hypocritical big-time televangelists making allegations against Baker, calling him, quote, "a cancer in the body of Christ," unquote, which is easily one of the greatest sentences I've ever read out loud. And his downfall led to infighting amongst Baker's fellow prosperity preachers to see who would lay claim to Baker's thorny crown and become king of the false prophets. It was a whole big, unholy mess, but in the end, following a 16-month probe, Baker would be indicted and found guilty of all 26 counts he was charged with, which included mail fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy, most of which stemmed from Baker fleecing his congregants with a variety of elaborate, inventive schemes. Baker was sentenced to 45 years in federal prison and was ordered to pay a $500,000 fine, but he ultimately served less than 5 years of his sentence due to a technicality with the judge who sentenced him, and this fucking guy, Alan Dershowitz, is the man who sprung Baker after he served less than 1/8 of his sentence. Dershowitz is, of course, the same attorney who worked with other such reputable clients as O.J. Simpson, Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, and one Donald John Trump, who very well may just be Jim Baker in disguise, only this time he's fleecing his followers from a political podium rather than a preacher's pulpit. Also, and this is kind of unrelated but just felt worth mentioning, Kevin Spacey played Jim Baker in the 1990 TV biopic entitled Fall from Grace, and well, that just feels like a fitting role and movie title for Mr. Spacey. So, holy shit, this segment has gone on way too long already, so let me attempt to wrap this up. I'll be honest, this is all infuriatingly fascinating to me, but I apologize if it feels like I've gotten just a bit off topic. Sometimes I forget Sometimes I forget that this is a Stephen King channel and lose sight of just what it was I had intended to talk about. After his release from prison in 1994, Baker still owed $6 million to the IRS, and his wife, Tammy Faye, was smart enough to divorce his ass back in '92 while he was still in prison. It took about a decade, but Baker tried his hand at televangelism once again in 2003, only this time he was forsaking the prosperity gospel approach, and instead he became focused on apocalypticism. You know how right-wing lunatics like Alex Jones are always shucking survival buckets of freeze-dried foods and are constantly fear-mongering to their audiences about a second civil war and the great replacement and the end times in order to get their unwitting, witless rube audiences to buy their discount doomsday prepper products? Well, you can thank Jim Bakker for that whole line of white Christian nationalist conspiracy theorist nightmare nonsense. Thanks, Jim, you fucker. During his post-prison preacher arc, Bakker made just so many absurd predictions and accusations, none of which came to fruition or proved to be true. And more recently, Bakker, of course, partook in the Trump big lie election fraud bullshit, as well as pushed fake COVID cures on his audience, which got him sued and ordered to pay out $157,000 to the poor saps who he convinced to purchase and ingest colloidal silver. So yeah, Jim Bakker is unfortunately still alive despite suffering a stroke in 2018. And if you ever wanted proof that there is no God, well, there you have it, folks. Or was Jim Bakker doing it right this whole time? Is he being rewarded with long life and wealth by the Heavenly Father for doing his bidding? Was Jim Bakker right all along? Or is he just a lifelong con artist who knows how to efficiently fleece an audience of naive folks who are desperate for meaning and to improve their lives, and so instead of doing anything that can affect change that requires tangible effort or direct action, they turn to televangelists who tell them they can simply pray all their problems away? Well, that, and they would of course have to send Jim some money and buy some of his doomsday rations to appease the apocalypse-thirsty Lord God Almighty. As for Tammy Faye, well, she was no saint during her early years of televangelism, but shockingly she advocated for the LGBTQ community on the PTL Club, something truly unheard of at the time. And she was openly sympathetic to folks who contracted AIDS and struggled with drug addiction. She urged people in her audience to embrace and love their gay brothers and sisters and tried to destigmatize and humanize addicts and AIDS victims. She eventually became a gay icon of sorts and saw quite the redemption arc in the wake of her husband's downfall. Tammy Faye, of course, passed away in 2007 because, again, there either is no God or he's a sadistic, merciless bastard. So now that I've gone and written a 2,500 plus word essay about scum of the earth Jim Bakker and the disgusting, blatantly fraudulent monetization of faith and the manipulation of unsuspecting rubes who only wanted a positive change in their lives but were too blind to see that they were being played for fools, what does any of this have to do with Stephen King's novel Needful Things, I hear you ask? And I'm so glad you asked. I have an answer for you. I'm really gonna try. Gonna bring it home in this next segment about neoliberalism. Neoliberalism and religion in Needful Things. Initially, I had been viewing this story through the lens of neoliberal policy and classism, and based on what King stated his inspiration for the story was, I don't think that was an inaccurate interpretation. Real quick, for those of you who may be less politically inclined, which, holy shit, that is honestly a great idea. Politics are a fucking nightmare. But anyway, neoliberalism is defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as a political approach that favors free market capitalism, deregulation, and reduction in government spending. Neoliberalism was perhaps not introduced for the first time in the United States in the 1980s, but it was through a series of economic reforms that the Reagan administration brought neoliberal economics full steam ahead, one of the most disastrous results of which is what is known today as trickle-down economics. But since this isn't supposed to be an educational video about the detrimental effects of neoliberal policies and practices, I'll just give a quick list of all the fantastic things that resulted in the implementation of neoliberal policy, followed by all the negative side effects of neoliberalism. The good. more options for consumers, more competitive markets. That's it. Those are the two. The bad: higher rates of poverty, less protection against falling into poverty, higher rates of unemployment, lower or stagnating wages, increased healthcare risks, decreased access to healthcare, social exclusion, increased wealth disparity, greater corporate power, greater corporate profits, the diminishment of social welfare programs, greater corporate influence over politics and politicians. So yeah, it sure seems that the bad far outweighs the good. Unless, of course, you're a multi-millionaire or billionaire CEO. And so when King, in his excerpt about what inspired him to write Needful Things, says that in the 80s everything had come with a price tag, that the decade quite literally was the sale of the century, and that the 80s was a decade in which people decided, for a while at least, yeah, that never changed, that greed was good and that hypocrisy was simply another tool for getting along, it was likely referring to the implementation and negative effects of neoliberal policies and Reaganomics, which were happening concurrently with the rise of the televangelist swindler epidemic. King's story takes a stance against the wealthy ruling class and the elite, in particular those who exploit the lower and middle class by proselytizing and proposing supposed solutions that have no substantive effect on their quality of life, while they continue to accumulate greater wealth and power themselves. And Leland Gaunt is 100% an unregulated free market capitalist if ever there was one. Gaunt sits atop the pyramid, pitting those below him against each other, making it so they are unwilling or unable to question the hold that Gaunt has over them. All the while they blame their fellow townspeople for their problems. At one point during the story's climax, as if to confirm Gaunt's staunchly neoliberal capitalist representation once and for all, when Sheriff Pangborn is making his final stand against him, Gaunt actually accuses Pangborn of being a communist for trying to take back the souls of those that Gaunt had swindled. In addition to being an exemplary free market capitalist whose sole purpose is to exploit the needs and wants of the public for personal gain and profit, Leland Gaunt, the sole proprietor of Needful Things, is much like Jim Bakker, a religious con man. He promises satisfaction, salvation, and exaltation to those who buy what he's selling, but those who come under his auspices are being misled. What is promised does nothing to fulfill or reward those who fall victim to the salesman's pitch, and rather these transactions ever enrich the peddler who sits at the top of the hierarchy, while those who purchase his wares fall further into desperation and despair. The solutions being offered to their problems do nothing to help them and lead them further into unfortunate circumstances. Hell, toward the end of the story, we actually have two factions from different denominations of the Christian faith battling in the streets, and it's all because the rhetoric and strategic tactics of Leland Gaunt have caused them to other and oppose each other. They allow their minute differences to divide them rather than to unite in solidarity through their faith. They worship the same God, they read the same scriptures, they sing the same hymns, and yet they're unable to see or appreciate those common beliefs, and instead focus on their differences and persecute each other for failing to worship the way that they deem to be appropriate. I sure can't think of any real-world parallels for that one. Oh well. And so King, through the character depiction of Leland Gaunt, has intertwined religious zealots and their neoliberal enablers and political counterparts. Gaunt represents every socio-political issue and consequence that had come to fruition as a result of the Reagan administration, which coincided with the rise of the monetized and televised religious escapades of the likes of Jim Bakker. King felt that things had gone terribly wrong on so many levels during the decade of the 80s, and he sums it all up particularly well with the following passage from Needful Things. King wrote, quote, Because in America, you could have anything you wanted, just as long as you could pay for it. If you couldn't pay or refused to pay, you would remain needful forever." Unquote. Final thoughts. Needful Things, even if you don't view it through a socio-political lens, is a great read. It's full of deception, devious manipulations, and truly egregious behavior by friends and neighbors. This was the first time I had revisited the story since my first read of the novel about a decade ago, and while I had remembered enjoying it, I was genuinely enthralled this time around. I'm an audiobook guy these days due to my busy life and also my inability to sit down and read a book without passing out. And Stephen King himself reads this one, which means every voice, every accent, every nuance is read exactly as King had intended it. So it's a great listening experience, and I highly recommend checking it out. This is something I wanted to make sure to include, but I couldn't find a gentle way to shoehorn it in, so I'll just throw it in here. King wrote a good sex scene in this story. It's well-timed, appropriately placed, not disgusting or weird, and is just a romantic, consensual depiction of the act between two adults. I know I've been a harsh critic of literally every other time King has written a sex scene prior to this novel, but he did a great job with this one, and I didn't feel revolted or creeped out by it in any way. Good job, Steve. You weren't a total freak for once. Well, that was one of the longer videos on this channel, and so if you're still here, I thank you for sticking around. My next video will be for the Needful Things movie adaptation, and that video will be out someday. Hopefully it won't take me a month and a half this time, but it probably will. Also, I just want to point out, I've got the little white collar here. It's actually a wrapper from a pair of chopsticks from my wife's Chinese takeout order. I just thought that was just so damn clever. All right, well, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Okay, goodbye. Be sure to click like and subscribe to the channel for my continued analysis of all things Stephen King. My name is Mr. Doyle, and this has been a great undertaking.